As someone who has spent a lot of time researching and consuming disturbing media, I've come across the same question time and time again, which is, how far is too far? Now, I'm not going to clickbait you guys and drag out the answer to that question. The actual answer is that it's completely subjective. What might be too far for me might not be far enough for you. There's no line in the sand that just acts as a universal rule for every single enjoyer of disturbing media. But I thought it would be interesting to go through some internet stories, most of them sourced from r/NoSleep, and discuss whether I personally think they go too far or not. That means we are going to be discussing a whole bunch of transgressive topics, including murder, torture, and sexual violence. I will not be gratuitous in my discussion of these aspects and will try to tread relatively lightly while also making it clear what's going on in the stories. If that's something that you're not interested in hearing about, or if you come to my channel for less intense content, then I completely understand if you want to skip this video. I promise I'll have some more lighthearted stuff coming up soon. I mean, as lighthearted as horror content can realistically be. But if you're someone like me who has a morbid interest in disturbing media, then buckle up because this is going to be a grimy video. There will be full spoilers for all of these stories, by the way. If you're interested in checking any of them out, I will leave a list of the titles of all these stories in the description of this video. But like I said, just be warned because a lot of these stories do get pretty gross. Okay, let's get what might be the most famous example of a story that goes too far out of the way at the beginning, and that is Borrasca. Borrasca is an interesting case because it's often cited as one of the best stories to ever come from NoSleep, but it's also controversial with its big reveal near the end. If you aren't familiar with the story, it follows a kid named Sam whose family is relocated to a small town in the mountains after an incident with his dad at the police department that he previously worked at. Sam quickly makes friends with two neighborhood kids, Kyle and Kimber, who show him a tree fort in the woods where people are rumored to go missing. At the end of the first part of the story, Sam's older sister Whitney goes missing, and the rest of the story follows the three kids as they grow older and start to question Whitney's disappearance. What makes Borrasca so interesting to me is that the setup is really good. You have these three kids who are starting to realize that all the adults in their town might be hiding something. We are introduced to the idea of these skinned men who are somewhat of an urban legend in the town and are implied to be a supernatural force that is taking the girls. There's also a strange, loud, metallic grinding sound that rings out through the town from the nearby mountains every once in a while, and also mentions of a shiny gentleman. And I personally think the author nails it in terms of like the actual language they use to describe these things, like the skinned men and the shiny gentleman and Borrasca. It's all very kind of weird, nebulous stuff that gets your mind thinking of like the worst possible creepy explanation for these things. In the later parts of the story, Kyle and Kimber start dating, and Kimber's mom supposedly commits suicide, and then Kimber goes missing in what's clearly a cover-up by her dad and the members of the local police. The controversial component of the story comes in at the end when Sam and Kyle discover Kimber, Whitney, and a whole bunch of other girls in an old mining facility near the town. The girls have been tied up and restrained to hospital beds and are forcibly impregnated by the de facto owner of most of the town, also the old sheriff and the new sheriff who is Sam's dad. We learn that the town has an issue with its water supply that makes it impossible for the women to get pregnant, so they started kidnapping girls and forcing them to give birth. They would then take the babies and either distribute them to the other members of the town or sell them on a sort of black market to support their dying town and the dying mining industry that used to be there. The first time I read Borrasca, I was pretty horrified by this reveal. I think most people would be. I think the reason it's so controversial is because the story doesn't hint towards anything even remotely as extreme as this before the last like 10% of the story. A lot of people got really sucked into what is intentionally presented as a potentially paranormal mystery, only to have the reveal be human trafficking and forced impregnation. For me personally, I don't think Borrasca goes too far for my own personal sensitivities, but I've also kind of soured on the ending as time has gone on because I don't think it holds up under scrutiny. Like, we were supposed to believe that instead of the town just like fixing the problem with their water supply, they would just immediately go for the forced impregnation route instead. Also, it's presented like this is still an issue that persists in the town today, but Kimber and a few other girls are abducted and they grew up there, so shouldn't they be unable to get pregnant as well? It also requires a ton of suspension of disbelief when you realize that literally every adult in the town knows what's going on and no one has ever gone to the FBI or anything like that. Sam, Kyle, and Kimber are completely appalled when they find out what's going on, so it seems like there would have been at least one person before them who tried to expose this whole operation as well. I also personally just think that the end of the story being a letter from Kimber's mom that just explains everything that was going on is a little forced and ties things up maybe a little too quickly. I know there's a fifth part of this story that I personally have not read yet, but the fourth part of the story was where it originally ended, so I kind of take that as like the first ending of the story. I don't think the story is bad overall. I actually think it's quite good, but I also think there are a lot of NoSleep stories that clear it in terms of overall quality. Okay, moving on on from Borrasca, we have a story that I have been asked to cover quite a few times, and that being the Pancake Family. This one is about an investigator recounting his experience finding a family that went missing, and he is led to a warehouse where he discovers their gruesome fate. Essentially, each member of the family was slowly, like over the course of literal decades, pressed down like a micrometer at a time by a hydraulic press and meticulously kept alive the entire time. So eventually each member of the family was pressed into a completely unrecognizable living pancake. It very much feels like something out of All Tomorrows. This one is certainly less extreme to me personally because it feels way less realistic than even something like Borrasca, which had its own flaws. I just don't think there is any conceivable way that you could flatten a human being and have them remain fully alive and conscious the entire time, although the idea is terrifying. So I wouldn't say that this story goes too far for my personal taste, but I also don't think it does a ton for me in terms of like actually scaring me. I think the idea of being forced into a very claustrophobic position or being buried alive is uniquely stressing, but this story abstracts the idea too much that I can't empathize with the family. I think if you're wanting a story about human beings forced into impossible shapes, then definitely check out All Tomorrows, which I also have a video on. It's a book about a hypothetical future in which humans like spread out across the galaxy, but are conquered by a race of aliens that can rewrite their genetic makeup on a whim. So a majority of the book is just dedicated to these pictures and descriptions of these creatures that were once human, but have been turned into these like bizarre, fleshy, animal-looking things. There was one branch of humanity in particular that are made into the colonials, which are little living filters that are fully sentient and exist to filter the waste of the aliens that conquer them. Their lives are complete abject misery, and they were cursed to be incredibly resilient and pretty much never die, and also reproduce rapidly to bring even more suffering into the world. There's a very striking image where after they are abandoned by their overlords, they are left on their planet just completely unable to die. Like they all just want their race to die out so nobody has to suffer anymore, but they can't even do that. And they all end up forming like a massive flesh quilt over the face of the planet and become this giant writhing mass of tortured suffering. It's very bleak. But since it's supposed to be like millions of years in the future and also involves aliens, it also makes it easier to suspend your disbelief as opposed to something like the Pancake Family. I think the best part of the Pancake Family is that the person who discovered the family is very clearly emotionally wrecked by what he saw, and he's written really well because of that. I always love when the horror of a situation is depicted through a secondhand account, because seeing those human reactions to the horror is always more unnerving to me. There's a movie called Seven, directed by David Fincher, that I really love, and I think it's a prime example of a movie doing some incredibly disturbing things but never taking them too far. In the movie, there's a serial killer who is killing his victims according to the 7 deadly sins. So for the gluttony sin, he force feeds a guy until his stomach explodes, and for sloth, he completely immobilizes a guy for months on end and keeps him alive the entire time. And we typically see the end results of all these murders, like the states that the bodies are found in, but I think the most impactful death, and most people seem to agree with me on this, is the lust death. We never actually see what happened to the victim, we just get an account of what happened from a man who was clearly emotionally wrecked by what he was forced to do. We learn that the killer cornered him at a sex club and forced him at gunpoint to wear a device that's essentially a sex toy with a knife attached to the end of it. He was then forced to sexually assault one of the sex workers, killing her in one of the most painful ways that you could possibly imagine. And again, we aren't shown any of this directly, but the guy that plays the man who was forced to do this is so good at acting that it makes the entire scene completely stomach-wrenching. Sorry for the long tangent, I just wanted to talk about Seven for a long time, and this felt like an appropriate moment to put that in. Okay, next up I want to talk about Tommy Taffy, or the third parent, as the original NoSleep story was called. This story is notable because I believe the guys on Creepcast actually skipped over a section because they felt it was too explicit, and I can totally see why. This story is about a family that is visited by Tommy Taffy, a strange, almost plastic-looking man with like no pores and a very like mannequin almost looking like face, and he insists on being the third parent in the household. We see pretty early on that Tommy has some sort of sexual interest in our antagonist and his younger sister, and when his mom tries to protect them, Tommy brutally attacks her. We learn that the dad grew up in a family that was also visited by Tommy Taffy, and that he seems to insert himself into the lives of anyone's kids that were previously visited by him. Up until the very end of the story, we are never explicitly told about what Tommy Taffy does to the kids, but it's heavily implied implied that he sexually assaults the main character's younger sister. The main part of the story that made the Creepcast boys nope out is near the end of the story when Tommy finds our main character with a Playboy magazine and forces himself on him. It's very uncomfortable, and the way that Tommy talks to the kid is really unnerving. He sees this as almost an intimate moment between the two of them, and it's very, very gross. To me, the first part of Tommy Taffy reads like a pretty straightforward allegory for the cycle of abuse that can unfortunately happen in families. Tommy Taffy will always show up to torment the kids of anyone who was tormented by Tommy Taffy, and he can also appear in multiple places at once and isn't like a singular entity. There are implications of this reading that Tommy Taffy is representing the cycle of abuse that I don't really love. The idea that Tommy Taffy is inescapable doesn't account for the overwhelming majority of abuse victims that never go on to abuse anybody else in their lives. But to me, the fact that the parents never really fight back that much against Tommy Taffy is representative of how when these things go unaddressed and are normalized, they are more likely to happen again and again. At least that's how I personally read the first story, but the later parts honestly killed any sort of deeper meaning or theme that I thought the author might have been going for. Part 2 isn't terrible. It's about the narrator of the first story's father, and we learn that his dad kept trying to kill Tommy Taffy and was then killed by Tommy Taffy in retaliation. The dad is like beaten up and brought out into the yard for everybody in the neighborhood to see, and then has a broom handle violently shoved down his throat. There was a moment at the end of the story where Tommy Taffy teaches the main character to associate love with pain and abuse that feels a little too on the nose for me. Also, I think the idea that the dad tries to kill Tommy Taffy over and over again kind of weakens the theme that maybe this is all about like systemic abuse. Because if somebody's father is fighting that hard against something, it would show that they actually do care about this and they are willing to put in the effort to stop this, but it doesn't matter in the end. And to me, that just weakens the theme of like parents standing idly by when something bad happens. But again, that's just my reading of the first story and it's not like canon or anything. But the later parts in this series aren't really good in my opinion because they reduce Tommy Taffy to just being like a slasher villain, and it makes the stories feel like they're just trying way too hard to be edgy. In general, I think it's easier to get away with including disturbing content if it feels like there is some sort of greater message underneath all of it. You can only be so disturbing for the sake of being disturbing before it comes off as try-hard, in my opinion. A really cool example of a piece of disturbing fiction that felt like it was using its disturbing content to get a theme across is the novel Gone to See the Riverman. It's a novel about a middle-aged woman who was weirdly obsessed with a serial killer who has been caught and is in prison at the time of the novel. The serial killer tasks her with going to find a mysterious riverman in the backwoods of his hometown, and she takes him up on this offer. For the first few chapters, I was wondering why our main character was doing any of this. She's also the primary caregiver for her older sister who has both a physical and intellectual disability. And I think that introducing our main character as someone who is taking care of their sister in this way inherently makes the reader view the protagonist as a relatively selfless person. But as the novel goes on and we start to get chapters that talk about our protagonist when she was a kid before her sister suffered the accident that caused her impairments, we start to realize that she was always kind of a terrible person. We learn that she pushed her sister off some rocks in an attempt to kill her, causing her current condition. We find out that the reason she did this was to prevent her sister from telling their parents about the fact that our protagonist was sexually abusing her own brother. It's really messed up. And as we learn more and more about how terrible of a person the narrator is, we go from thinking, why is she talking to this horrible serial killer, to like, maybe these two deserve each other. I've read tons of books where we go from liking a character to hating them, but I don't know if I've ever seen this done so effectively with the protagonist of a book. If that book sounded interesting to you, then definitely check it out. I spoiled a little bit of it, but I didn't really get into like the actual main plot of the story at all. The next story I want to talk about is one called Mrs. Wilson's Homemade Jam. This is one that I found when scrolling like random Reddit posts looking for recommendations. It's about a guy who used to get special homemade jam from a nice lady named Mr. Wilson that lived down the street from him. The narrator talks about how the jam was his absolute favorite and that nothing he has ever tasted has been quite as good as her jam. But unfortunately, when Mrs. Wilson started getting older, she told the narrator that she was unable to make any more of the jam, and after she passes away, she leaves him a note. The narrator doesn't read the note at first, but asks his parents about Mrs. Wilson, and they tell him that they discovered the secret ingredient to her jam and were absolutely disgusted. It turns out she would routinely purposely miscarry and then use the miscarried fetuses as the secret ingredient to her jam. Very, very gross. The story ends with the narrator looking at the note that Mrs. Wilson gave him and finding out that it's a recipe for the homemade jam. And the final stinger is the narrator revealing that his wife is pregnant and he wonders whether he can get her to make some jam of his own. So obviously the story is super gross. Just the idea of making jam out of any sort of medical waste is horrifying, and the fact that it's like jam specifically makes it so much worse for some reason. I think the biggest fault of this story is just the fact that it is a no-sleep story, so as soon as we are introduced to someone's special jam with a secret ingredient, we all immediately assume the worst. Like, I immediately knew that there was going to be some form of human remains in that jam. There was just no way the story was not going to go into that direction. I personally also think that the final twist with the narrator saying that he's going to make his own jam with the baby that his wife is pregnant with is like a little too predictable or on the nose. I think if the story had ended with our narrator being super disgusted, then it honestly would have been better. Like, maybe he leaves his pregnant wife because he can't look a baby in the eyes ever again after what he knows he has done. There was something uniquely invasive about being fed something that you weren't aware of, and I think that the story could have played with the psychological effects of that happening to someone. But instead, the narrator is just immediately on board with the idea of putting ground up fetuses into jam, which kind of comes out of nowhere. Like, there's just no way the jam was that good, man. But if this story is your jam, pun intended, then you should check out The Cannibal by Chuck Palahniuk, which I first read in his Make Something Up short story collection. Palahniuk is a really great author. I've loved pretty much everything I've read by him. He's famous amongst disturbing literature fans for his Guts short story. And that story is pretty foul. It's about a man who gets his intestines sucked out through his butt and is forced to chew through them in order to escape the situation he is in. And I feel like most degenerates like myself are just passively aware of that story, but I personally think that The Cannibal is worse. It's so gross. I don't want to spoil it, mostly because I don't even want to talk about what's going on, but one element of the story that I found fascinating was its use of subtlety. The extreme grossness of the situation is never explicitly confirmed, but you have more than enough context clues to understand what's actually going on. After I finished reading it, I had to look it up on Reddit to hopefully find that my interpretation of the story was actually incorrect. It was not incorrect, and I'm scarred for life now. Moving on to the last story I want to talk about before I go take a shower to wash all of this metaphorical filth off of my mind, we have The Girl in the Box. Of all the stories that I've talked about so far, this is the one that feels the most to me like it's just someone's fetish creative horror fiction. It's about a man who talks to a girl on an extreme BDSM internet forum and gets her to agree to being sadistically tortured by him. Now, I don't think that premise is inherently flawed. I think that a story that dives into the nuances and inner emotions of sadomasochists could be really interesting. The level of torture and humiliation that the girl supposedly agreed to is so beyond extreme that I think if the story was told from her perspective, it might have been an interesting read. There's a famous real-life incident where someone agreed to be killed and eaten by a cannibal, and they actually met up and he was killed and eaten by that cannibal. And that story has always fascinated me because I just have no idea how your mind can get to a place where you'd agree to take part in something like that. And then beyond that, you have to find somebody who is willing to do something like that to you, and it's just like this weird example of the two worst people finding each other at the exact wrong time to have both of their desires fulfilled. But The Girl in the Box doesn't really explore anything remotely interesting with its characters. It is just a man describing in detail all of the horrible things that he does to the girl. The story ends with the girl being completely encased in concrete, and I suppose that there are some interesting logistical hurdles that the author describes in this process. But the story itself just felt like it was kind of lacking substance. It just feels like someone writing the worst thing they could possibly imagine and then seeming like a little too excited about it. In my mind, if you want a good story about someone being held captive by a volatile and dangerous person, then just go read Misery by Stephen King. That book is awesome. Even if you've seen the movie like I had before I read it, you should still read the book because it's seriously way more brutal and my jaw was on the floor during certain scenes. But anyways, The Girl in the Box is probably the worst thing I read for this video. I think worst both in terms of like its quality, but also just like it being super gross. And having gone through all of these gross stories and given my thoughts on them, I do just want to reiterate the point that I made at the beginning of this video, that being disturbing is subjective. I think the word disturbing has kind of taken on another meaning where we equate it with simply shocking or extreme. But if I really think about what it means to be disturbed, then I think about something that stays with me and that makes me feel uneasy for a while after I experience it. And for me, none of these stories really stuck with me for that long after I read them. Now, that could just be my absolutely cooked brain, but again, it's all subjective. For something to really disturb me, it has to be something that my mind is constantly going back to, which typically means it's something that is kind of confusing that I can't really make sense of. I think that's why things like Lake Mungo or Petscop or Raphael by Stephen Graham Jones have stuck with me for a while. Those are works that have actually like disturbed me. But I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on the stories that I've talked about here. I'd also love to hear your recommendations for disturbing no sleep stories as well. If you haven't subscribed yet, then please do. I'm trying to reach 200,000 subscribers by the end of 2026. I talk about internet horror and horror literature on this channel. I typically make longer videos, but I've been in a bit of a creative slump, which is why I've had quite a few short videos in a row. A massive thank you to all my gold tier channel members: Lucas Fernando, Chris Lamb, Tyler the Leper, Blue Radio Media, Mishroy16, Cherry Shark, Starlight Pink, Jackson Moore, Amanda Castillon, Arcade Link Author, The Official Gar, Sasso, Ybab Flow, Hi, Jenna Berry, Semra, Laura Gonza, Ben Best, Classic Pats Games Plus, Marin Elizabeth, Anexidum, Digital Fox, Sherbert, Emilio Nomura, Temple, Jupiter Rainstorms, Maddie, Alice Hale, Charity, Jess, Miley Bop, Abigail Wagner, Sundry Productions, Canadine, Uton, and McGee's, Site 42, Maya S, Moss, Red, Ezra, FM, Alicia, Lemonade Lake, Chipsa, Heat O'Brien, Yoom the Epic, Spirit Hotline, Don't Play Brass Beast on Blue, Furbish GDDC, Catcher Elizabeth, Mayfield, Shruby, Litcher Something, Hexmaniac Rafa, Jazz, Homie Gaming, Sue, Junie, Danny, Steel Cut Oaths, Veronica Heredia, Phantoms Forever, Ashley, Coco Boco, BB, Archie, Felly, Killer Ray 257, Jojo, an otter in a trench coat, Icky Teal, GLKA, Thespian Rose, Safety Waffles, 731 Hamsters, Corkback Ruler, Toby Dandelion, Red, Zappo Dappos, Tiny Moss Patch, Mary A, Charlie Smidge, Out of the Fandom, Creeping Freely for You Too, Meadow, Soundwayne, Silent Trails, Flatwoods Monster Webkins, Merly, Cedar, Salvador Rigodi, Florapaws, Patricia Zhang, Miguel, Jesse Salo, Alexandra Taylor, Finch, Oka, Violet, Hell of a Fan of Pugs, Poppy Stan Account, Geck, Lou, Racin, Dr. Doge, Meadow, Emily Huber, Shy Lancy, Kat Hughes, Rosie Vest, Leo, Marcus Cliver, Uneven Pineapple, Commissar Dorothy, Trista Marie, Jesse King, Jinsulia, Silent Trails, Nathan Lawrence, Big Al, Upine, Hollington, and Tyler Wilson. Thank you guys all so much for supporting me and supporting what I do here on the channel, and thanks again to everybody for watching this video. Like I said, let me know what you'd like me to cover. If you have a longer creepypasta or no sleep story you'd like me to read, then please let me know as well, because I'm looking for one, like a longer story I can cover, similar to my left-right game videos or my tapers video. But I think that's going to do it for this video, so I will catch you in the next one. See ya. Take me up again, let me see the stars. Is there life on Mars? 'Cause I've run out of luck here on Earth. I'm a wanderer. Another trip around the sun makes these memories flood, and I could wash it down with the atmosphere. You're cool blue and crystal clear. An astronaut flying above, but can't fall in love. Floating alone, brave enough to see the cosmos, too scared to say hello. And I know one day I'll be gold